Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories.
These CCTV images from the Paris Ritz Hotel would have been erased, deleted, and forgotten long ago. However, one of the 4 people in the elevator at that time was the most famous woman in the world. And this is her last video. At midnight, all 4 of them will go out the back door, get into a Mercedes, and a few minutes later, a tragedy will happen. Circumstances and suspicious details that the whole world will discuss without exaggeration. Diana's death was a shock. She was not just a princess, she was a superstar. If Instagram had existed 30 years ago, she would have had the most popular account. Many considered Diana to be the epitome of celebrity, and I'm afraid they greatly underestimated the situation. Her wedding was watched by the whole of Britain, her divorce was discussed by half the world. The day after the death, tens of thousands of grieving people flooded the streets of London, and only the royal family did not say a word. Those who were sure that the secret services were behind Diana's death, and the people from Buckingham Palace, were even more convinced of their rightness, although the supporters of this version already had a lot of arguments. But let's talk about everything in order. The story of Princess Diana is, of course, a fairy tale. Sometimes a fairy tale from Disney, sometimes an uncensored fairy tale from the Brothers Grimm. Part Shakespearean tragedy, part reality show. In this video, I will tell you about everything at once. This is the story of Princess Diana. Okay, let's start with a little disclaimer. This video is not intended for people under the age of 15. Not because it is very intellectual, and not because it is very indecent. It's just that if you're under 15, then for you, most likely, Lady Diana is a popular YouTube channel with 12 million subscribers. I'm going to talk about a completely different time. The time before YouTube appeared, no one knew about the iPhone or Google. People wore funny clothes and equally funny hairstyles, and most of these people read newspapers. Those same sheets of paper with news, photos, and a crossword puzzle. Newspapers and, first of all, tabloids will play an important role in this story. They will make Diana a superstar, and they will be partly to blame for her death. A few weeks before the tragic night in Paris, these pictures will occupy the front pages of the British tabloids. The photos were taken on a tip from Diana herself as revenge on her ex-husband Prince Charles and his mistress. For these shots, the photographer received £250,000 from the newspaper. At that moment, Diana was the only woman in the world whose fuzzy photos in a swimsuit could cost so much. Dodi Al-Fayed, heir to his father's vast financial empire, is one of the 4 people in the elevator. The other 2 are security officers who worked for Al-Fayed. This is the last day of August 1997. Everything happens around midnight at the Chic Ritz Hotel in the center of Paris. It is impossible to exit through the main entrance. Dozens of journalists, paparazzi, and fans gathered in anticipation of the princess and her boyfriend. Diana and the company used the emergency exit, get into the Mercedes, and drive away. The secret maneuver worked, but not for long. Several paparazzi on motorbikes and scooters begin the pursuit. The Mercedes drives out onto the embankment of the Sena River and approaches the tunnel under the Alma Bridge. Once Diana was not famous, once she was a girl from an aristocratic family from central England. The marriage of Count Johnny Spencer and his young wife Frances Roche began to break up even before the birth of Diana. But a public break occurred when the future princess was 6 years old. And the reason for this was partly the same circumstances that would destroy the family and the Princess of Wales herself. A few decades later, in the early 50s, it was difficult to find a more profitable match in British high society than John Spencer. His pedigree went back to the 15th century. Johnny himself was a handsome man in his 30s. Although the 20th century had already passed the equator by that time, the marriage traditions of British high society strongly resembled a mixture of the novel Pride and Prejudice and the Bridgerton series. Scores, palaces, tuxedos, and dresses. Mutual feelings are welcome, but not guaranteed. For Frances Roche's mother, one of the main tasks in life was to successfully marry off her daughter, and she succeeded. A significant role was played, even if not the closest, but still ties with the royal family. Diana's grandmother brought Johnny Spencer and her daughter Frances together when the latter was still 15. I had to wait a few years before the newlyweds could get married. By the early 60s, the still young Frances already had 3 children, one of whom died as an infant, compounding the tragedy and the fact that it was a boy. Then, instead of the long-awaited heir, Diana was born on the 1st of July, 1961st year. It is difficult to say what exactly destroyed the marriage of the parents of the future princess. Perhaps it was social norms and traditions that forced Francis to get married right after school, and Johnny to take Frances as his wife, despite the almost announced engagement to another girl. Perhaps the cause was the death of the first son. Perhaps Johnny Spencer's poor condition. By that time, his father was still alive, and Johnny, accordingly, had not yet passed the title and fortune. Anyway, 3 years after Diana was born, she had a younger brother, and a long-awaited heir in the family. For 28-year-old Frances, this was the 5th birth. Soon Diana's mother began an affair on the side, which eventually led to a breakup with her husband at the end of 1967. On Christmas, John Spencer announced to his wife that he was taking custody of the children from Frances. His title and position allowed him to do this. After the Christmas holidays, the mother packed up, left the children and left. Later, Diana admitted that it was the most painful moment in her life. The so-called boarding school is still a popular format of education for children from high society in Britain. In fact, this is a prestigious boarding school where parents take their children only for the weekend. Diana studied at one of these schools. The rules and foundations in the aristocratic circles of Britain changed much more slowly than in the rest of society. This was also reflected in schools, where girls' social skills were valued much more than academic ones. For example, one of the important accents in teaching was neat handwriting. Teachers were not required. Diana herself showed no interest in the sciences. The lack of education will not come back to her again in the future, and to some extent, will even destroy the marriage of the future Princess of Wales. At school, Diana earned a reputation as a girl who loved to fantasize and arrange dramas from scratch. It wasn't hard to explain. The children were brought up by their father, who did not always take Diana out of school, even on weekends. And when the future Princess of Wales was 14, he remarried. The new chosen one was Reine Carlid. Diana disliked her stepmother immediately, which was an understandable reaction of a child of divorced parents. The girl escaped from reality in 2 ways. Either she sneaked into the big deserted hall of the school and started dancing, or she read romance novels with a binge. First of all, the books of Barbara Cartland. By an amazing coincidence, the writer was the mother of the Rhineland, new stepmother Diana. However, the girl liked such books not because of kinship with the author, but because of the content. Barbara Cartland was a real phenomenon in the world of British literature. During her life, she wrote more than 700 novels, bad and cheap but very popular. Most of them worked according to the same scheme. A simple and not very intelligent girl met the prince and found her happiness. In a word, it was the kind of literature that corroded the brain, but at the same time, gave emotion. In these stories, there was everything I dreamed of and hoped for, Diana recalled. She was literally hooked on the Cartland book. Perhaps all of Diana's ideas about how a relationship between a man and a woman should look like migrated from these novels. In the mid-70s, John Spencer's father died, and therefore he became a full-fledged earl and received the family estate of Elter. Diana and her sisters gained the title of lady. Diana spent her last school years in Switzerland. My father hoped that they would definitely teach me how to cook and speak French. Nothing more was needed because, like most aristocratic girls, Diana was being prepared not for university, but for marriage. Neither French nor cooking, the future princess has not mastered. The exams were failed miserably, not once, but twice. And that was the end of Diana Spencer's education. Diana often repeated to herself throughout her life. The closest analog of the expression in Russian is dumb as a cork. This Princess of Wales spoke, as a rule, with a smile, which demonstrated the presence of self-irony and lack of shame about it. In 1979, Diana made a coming out. At that time in Britain, the phrase primarily meant the end of training and the release of a girl, and not her sexual orientation. 18-year-old Spencer moved to London and lived in an apartment with several friends. Girls from the high society of Britain at that time led a much more modest lifestyle than representatives of the golden youth of our time. Diana and her friends were working. As a rule, on acquaintance, not for money, but still worked. A couple of years before they don't get married. Diana was a cleaner, a nanny, and a kindergarten teacher's assistant. This was her last job. It was there that the photo was taken, which got on the pages of the tabloids. Newspapers became interested in Diana Spencer immediately after they learned that she was the beloved of the future King of England, Prince Charles, in the 80s and 90s in Britain. As you know, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. Hints of future family troubles can be found already in Diana's childhood and youth. But the second component is missing for the completeness of the picture: her husband, Prince Charles. The first meeting of the future royal couple took place back in the mid-60s. The high society of Britain is not very big, and sometimes the children of the Spencers and Queen Elizabeth spent time together. Diana was 4 years old, Prince Andrew was about the same age. One day, they were playing with each other, and at that moment Prince Charles came into the room. If it were a fairy tale, then there would be an immediate sympathy between Diana and Prince Charles. But this was real life, and in it Diana was 4 years old, and Prince Charles was 17. The age difference will be far from the only one, but one of the important reasons for a failed marriage. In case you don't remember, Prince Charles is the son of Queen Elizabeth II. In addition to Charles, she has 3 other children, but all the others were much less interested in the public. Charles was being watched precisely because he was the future heir to the throne. Who knew that Elizabeth's health would be so strong? From the outside, Prince Charles has always looked a little awkward and out of place. His behavior and appearance have been a frequent cause for jokes in recent decades. Although, is it any wonder, the man himself once admitted in an interview that he talks to plants. But more on that later. However, the inner circle knows Charles from a completely different side. In the 70s, he was an enviable bachelor with a lot of affairs. He graduated from Cambridge, was very well read, appreciated art, and had a great sense of humor. One of Charles' close friends is the famous comedian and writer Stephen Fry. He's certainly good at humor. Besides, Charles was rich. By that point in history in Britain, an aristocratic title did not always mean having money. Many estates were in a deplorable state. Their owners simply had no money for maintenance. Charles owned land and real estate in the county of Cornwall. This brought in an excellent income of £14 million a year. All of the above explained the great popularity of Prince Charles among girls from high society. Almost every week, there was a note in the tabloids that the future Queen of England had been found. And each time, it was a different girl. Charles himself, in his early 30s, was not exactly eager to get married. That's just the title of heir to the throne did not really leave him the right to choose. The Queen Mother and the Prince's uncle actively lobbied for their candidacies. As a result, Prince Charles gave up and made an offer, and not one, but 2 at once. Both girls refused. Perhaps they understood that the royal title was more of a burden. The realities of life in the palace are far from fabulous. Perhaps both potential brides knew about the feelings that Charles had for a girl named Camilla Shent. Among the many novels of Charles before Diana, it was the relationship with Camilla that was special. She was a girl from high society, but at the same time very simple. She loved spending time in nature, riding and fishing. Everything that Charles adored and Princess Diana would later hate. Camilla's relationship with Charles lasted 6 months in the early 70s. Then he went to do military service on the ship, hoping that Camilla would be waiting. There is a version that if Charles had proposed before his departure, then everything could have turned out differently. Camilla could have agreed, and this video would have lost all meaning. But, most likely, Charles would have been refused by both the Queen and Camilla herself. The first one would not have agreed because of the rich love life of the chosen one before Charles. Camilla herself, despite the affair with the heir, was in love with a completely different person, Andrew Parker Bowes. When I said that the story of Princess Diana and the royal family resembles a reality show or a soap opera, I meant it. In the early 70s, an interesting love triangle developed. Prince Charles was in love with Camilla. Camilla was not against a relationship with Charles, but she was in love with Andrew Parker Bowles. Andrew Parker Bowles was not against a relationship with Camilla, but had many other affairs, including with Princess Anne. Princess Anne is the only daughter of Elizabeth II and the sister of Charles. As a result, the engagement and wedding of Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla took place quickly, which was probably facilitated by members of the royal family. Charles was still doing his military service on the ship at that time. However, Camilla's marriage began to get upset almost immediately. Most likely, her husband's infidelities pushed her to continue her relationship with Charles. Time is an amazing thing. In the mid-60s, Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowes will divorce. 10 years later, a happy Andrew will be one of the main guests at the wedding of Charles and Camilla, but in the 80th year. No one could even think about it. Then the members of the royal family were tormented by 2 problems. The Prince of Wales, aka Prince Charles, continued to have an affair with married Camilla, and it got into the press. In addition, the prince was not getting any younger, and the search for a potential wife was a matter of national importance. One of the requirements for the candidate was her virginity. Not that it was something mandatory, but in general, it is also important. There were no such candidates among the peers of Charles, who by that time was already 31, so all the attention of the family was paid to those who were younger. In a word, if Diana had not existed at that moment, she would have been worth inventing. In 1977, Charles had a brief affair with Sarah Spencer, Diana's older sister. The Prince of Wales crossed paths with 16-year-old Diana, but perhaps Charles would not even have remembered these brief meetings, if not for the events that occurred 3 years later. In the 80th year, Diana Spencer begins to receive frequent invitations to events where Charles is present. The invitations came at the initiative of the Queen Mother, who noticed the young Spencer. At one of the balls, the long-awaited contact took place. The candidacy of Diana, an innocent girl from an aristocratic family, suited not only the royal family, but also Camilla. On the one hand, she did not plan to divorce. On the other hand, she wanted to continue her relationship with Charles. Diana, in her opinion, was not a strong barrier because of her stupidity and youth. A big step forward for Spencer was the invitation to Balmoral. This is the ancestral castle of the Queen in Scotland. In addition to Charles and the Queen herself, many members of the royal family were present. Diana actively fit into all the entertainment of the family at Balmoral. Even the most hated. She shot, fished, and most importantly, was a cheerful girl who laughed at Charles' jokes, and did not forget to speak respectfully about the prince. In short, she pulled all those tricks that work successfully on most men. The girl may have been poorly educated, but her emotional intelligence was clearly on top. Besides, she was really in love with Charles then. The tabloids knew that a potential future princess was visiting Balmoral. Who she is and what she looks like, though not immediately, but still found out. A reporter from the Sun newspaper came to the kindergarten where Diana was working at that moment and asked to take her photo. The next day, a photo of the potential chosen one of Charles of Wales was published in the newspaper. Diana was terrified. Most readers and Charles were of a different opinion. Women noted a sweet, kind, and a little shy expression on their faces, men long, slender legs that shone through a light dress. Britain was beginning to fall in love with Diana. However, the prince was in no hurry to make an offer. The mention of Diana in the tabloids increased. The pressure of the press and the royal family on Charles increased. He was literally pushed to make an offer. In the end, to everyone's delight, the long-awaited engagement took place. And at this point, it is impossible not to mention the context. In the late 70s and early 80s, Britain and the monarchy in particular were going through hard times. The appearance of punks and, first of all, Sex Pistols was a response to the huge percentage of unemployed among young people, and the isolation of the establishment from real life. It seemed that the monarchy was under threat. However, doubts about the greatness of the royal family were dispelled the moment the country saw these shots. The wedding of the Prince of Wales and Diana Spencer was the embodiment of a fairy tale for a huge number of people from Britain and other countries. The fabulous money spent on this event was of interest only to the most ardent critics of the monarchy. None of that mattered. What was really important was a modest girl in a white dress. Yesterday, no one knew her. Today she is riding in a carriage, surrounded by the royal guard, to become a princess. However, the fairy tales on that fairy tale are too far from reality. Diana is still considered an icon of style, but the choice of a wedding dress raises many questions and perplexities. A lot of dresses and very little princess. Diana herself, many years after the events, experienced that feeling for which there is a special word. Cringe or awkwardness for those who are older. Although, what was to be expected from a 19-year-old girl? This is exactly what the princess dress looked like in her head, which she probably imagined reading romance novels. None of the staff of the royal court helped Diana with the choice. A 19-year-old girl herself, with a couple of designers, created a dress that 700 million people will see after that. For 6 months from the engagement to the celebration, Diana lived at Buckingham Palace. This is the same Buckingham Palace from the center of London and from the pages of an English textbook. However, for its inhabitants, this is a completely different place. The most important thing is Buckingham Palace, the Queen's main residence, and absolutely everything there works for one single person. Elizabeth II. All the others are secondary, and a million rules, many of which sound crazy, must be followed. For example, the servants should be inconspicuous. If the monarch is walking down the corridor, then the servants should ideally leave this space even before the Queen appeared there. If this was not possible, then they should bow and stand absolutely noiselessly, waiting until the Queen leaves. The servants are supposed to walk along the corridors exclusively along the wall, otherwise they will crumple the carpet in the middle, along which the monarch should walk. Diana, who before the engagement lived in a noisy apartment with several friends, now found herself in an empty space where there were not only people of her age, but often no people at all. The palace is an absolutely dead place on weekends and on weekday evenings when there are no servants there. Charles was anywhere but with his fiancée. And at first, Diana didn't even have an assistant who could tell her everything, explain all the rules and traditions. That is, outside the palace, Diana was already in the center of attention, inside it absolutely secondary. It is during this period that Diana shows the first signs of bulimia, a disease that many in the world learn about. Precisely because of the Princess of Wales. This is a mental disorder when a person consumes a large amount of food in a short time, and then, artificially causing vomiting, begins to empty the stomach. There were many reasons for Diana's concern at that time, but here is the most important of them. The first one. A week after the engagement, at the end of February 1981, she and Charles give a joint interview. It goes on 4 or 5 minutes, but the most interesting moment is this one. Whatever the word in love does not mean. It is difficult to say which answer to the question about falling in love would be worse, perhaps not even, it would not sound so terrible. After the wedding, this interview was gradually forgotten and remembered much later. When news about the problems in the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales began to penetrate the press, Diana said in later interviews that Charles' similar response was very traumatic for her. There are 2 things that can be recalled in Charles' justification. First of all, this is a person who not only talks to plants, but a person who tells the press that he talks to plants. Interviews are not his strong suit. Secondly, Charles may not have really been in love with Diana. At least, he himself talked about it much later during the divorce. Yes, a divorce interview can hardly be considered a source of objective information. This is the time when the couple remembers the joint experience as negatively as possible. Most likely, the truth is somewhere in between. Charles still felt where they had some feelings, but before and after the engagement, he strongly doubted them. And I can understand it. At the time this video is being recorded, I am the same age as Charles when he proposed, namely 32. Diana, let me remind you, was 19. When I imagine that I need to marry a girl with such an age difference, several problems arise at once. Firstly, my current wife would probably be against it, and secondly, 13 years is a lot. Especially if we take into account the very different intellectual and cultural background of the newlyweds. That's what I mean. Elizabeth II ascended the throne when Charles was 5. Instead of mom, there was a queen. According to the rules, the boy from childhood officially coordinated meetings with his mother and greeted her with a handshake instead of hugs. By the will of his father, the young prince was sent to a strict Scottish school, which was famous for severe discipline. After school, Charles had Cambridge, one of the best universities in the world, where he fully revealed his love for literature and theater. Charles read exquisite philosophical books, his wife cheap romance novels. Charles could support any small talk, from politics to art. His wife had difficulty formulating thoughts. And what is also important, because of his origin, Charles, in simple terms, was not in the trend at all. He, in fact, has not been in contact with the outside world since birth. Pop music for him was opera. And if the chronological gap between the newlyweds was 13 years, then the psychological gap was 30. Even before the wedding, Diana began to have the same effect of waiting for the versus reality. Life in the palace was not at all what she had imagined, and most importantly, the prince was not the one she had read about in romance novels. Diana was beginning to realize that she was in love with the image of Prince Charles from her head rather than with a real person. After all, she simply did not know him. Just imagine, from the very beginning of Diana and Charles' relationship until the moment of the wedding, they saw each other only 13 times. It is impossible not to remember about Charles's gift to Camilla, which he decided to make shortly before his wedding. Diana accidentally found a bracelet for her former lover and in her later interviews talked about how much it upset her. Despite all this, the wedding took place. Simply because it was in the interests of all parties. The royal family found a wife for the heir. Diana somehow realized a youthful dream. Britain got its princess. The newly made Princess of Wales had a hope that all the troubles after the engagement would settle down by themselves. The royal family will accept her as their own. Charles will spend time with his young wife and completely forget about Camilla. However, none of this happened. On the contrary, the situation has only gotten worse. The royal family in relation to Diana can partially justify the following. All these people, including Charles, were brought up and lived in absolutely closed conditions. They had little contact with the outside world. It sincerely seemed to them that Diana, by definition, had to be familiar with the unspoken and public rules of behavior within the royal family. However, the Princess of Wales belonged to a completely different generation of aristocratic children. The ones who loved to walk around London, followed modern trends in music and fashion, and were not so sensitive about their status. It was all very far from the royal family. Okay, this is probably the moment when you need to say a few words about what the monarchy and the Queen in particular meant to Britain 40 years ago, and still means. Look, 500 years ago, the power of the English king was absolute. In the morning, he could attack someone, chop off their heads in the afternoon, and in the evening feast feast feast. 150 years ago, the power of the monarch was much more modest, but still significant. Today, as in the 80s, the monarch in fact had no power, but the importance of the queen is difficult to overestimate. She is not a prime minister who comes and goes, she is a symbol of history, a symbol of the country, and a symbol of traditions. You are born with a royal title and you die with it. Throughout their lives, members of the royal family, and especially the monarch, are forced to do what is required of them, and not what they want. Yes, you can refuse this and there were examples, but these are rather those exceptions that only confirm the rules. Therefore, the detachment towards Diana, especially from the Queen and her husband Prince Philip, was explained precisely by this. Elizabeth ascended the throne very early because of the death of her father. She was in her early 20s. Her whole life, and the life of her inner circle, is service to the crown. Minimal emotionality is part of professional duties. In many ways, this is why the royal family could not fully understand Diana's depressed psychological state, her tantrums and breakdowns. There were two main reasons for this behavior. The first one was absolute loneliness. No one in the palace cared about Diana, including Prince Charles. The second reason is Diana's confidence in her husband's ongoing affair with Camilla even after the wedding. And, most likely, she was right. Although officially Charles said that their romance resumed only 5 years after the wedding in the 86th year. But it wasn't like that. Even during the honeymoon, he called Camille, and later they were noticed together at several events. It is the novel that will become the main reason for the development of bulimia in Diana. The girls of the Spencer family were predisposed to eating disorders on the background of psychological problems. For example, in Sarah's older sister, this manifested itself in anorexia. Diana's constant bouts of vomiting further alienated Charles from her. In 1982, the relationship between the prince and the princess began to improve for a short time. First Diana was pregnant, then a son, the future Prince William, was born, and less than a year later, the couple went on their first big foreign tour. This is a famous trip to Australia and New Zealand. To say that it was a success would be a strong underestimation. In each of the cities, the Prince and Princess of Wales were greeted by cheering crowds. Men, women, and children were absolutely delighted. All the front pages of the local press were devoted to the visit of the royal family. Photos of happy Diana and Charles dancing at a charity ball and playing with their young son created the illusion of a happy fairy tale marriage. In fact, it was much more complicated. In rare pictures from this tour, you can see the puzzled face of the princess and even outright hysteria. Such tours of the royal family are not entertainment, but a thoughtful political action. In this case, incredibly responsible. Once Australia was a British colony, today it is a constitutional monarchy, and it was like that 30 years ago. The official head of state is the British king. In this case, Elizabeth II, however, not all residents of Australia are satisfied with this state of affairs. There are many supporters of independence there, and in the early 80s, these sentiments were very popular. The success of Diana and Charles' visit was so deafening that by the end of their trip, the absolute majority of Australians were in favor of preserving the monarchy. But the main merit in this did not belong to Charles, but to his wife. When the couple got out of the car, the cheering crowd shouted, "She's coming," instead of "They're coming," or simply exclaimed "D." As the car passed people standing on both sides of the road, the side that could see Charles did not hide his disappointment. During this visit, Charles and members of the royal family were confronted with the unexpected and crushing success of the princess with the public. But most importantly, now Diana herself understood her popularity. Newspaper covers with Diana's image were published more and more often. The editors quickly realized one simple secret. The face of the Princess of Wales on the homepage was guaranteed to increase sales. Diana was not just beginning to realize her popularity, she was beginning to enjoy it. The princess carefully studied every article devoted to her person. The royal family's confusion over Diana's popularity is understandable. In the early 80s, it was not entirely obvious why everyone was interested in Diana and not her husband, the heir to the throne. History will help explain this. 1953. Elizabeth II becomes queen. In post-war Britain, the royal family was written about as a dear dead man, either good or nothing. There were unspoken rules between the press and the family, which assumed respectful relations on the part of journalists. In the 70s, the situation began to change dramatically. The number of daily national newspapers has exceeded 10, as well as local publications. Every day, the British bought 20 million copies. The competition grew, and in order to stand out from the general background, more and more publications began to focus on sensation. The tabloids were the most brazen, the most scandalous, the most simple, the most popular. Intrigues and novels in aristocratic circles were constantly on the pages of newspapers, including the most intimate details. What is the publication of the diaries of an escort who had a relationship with the Minister of Defense in the late 60s worth? The famous body of a professional, a scandal throughout the country, the resignation of a minister, millions of copies. Despite this, the royal family was not touched. However, she did not really give a reason. The life of Buckingham Palace and its inhabitants was as boring as possible. So much so that the newspapers sometimes forgot to write about this or that duty visit of the Queen. Diana was a great occasion. Young, lively, emotional, and open. She kissed her little son in public, willingly clasped hands with cheering fans from the crowd. All these qualities made her the opposite of Queen Elizabeth and the rest of the family as much as possible. Therefore, the popularity of the Princess of Wales in the press gradually turned into a problem for the inhabitants of the royal palace. After a successful visit to Australia, Diana hoped that the Queen would personally receive her and say words of gratitude. None of this happened. Diana's further successes in public will also be met with silence. Since it was not possible to establish relations with any of the members of the new family, Diana created a new social circle for herself. Representatives of the fashion world, employees of the Walk magazine, stylists and designers. Meeting them, as well as forming her public image, became Diana's new hobby. Today, the princess is considered an absolute icon of style. However, this skill was developed gradually, and failures happened. In addition to the magnificent wedding dress, in the first half of the 80s, there were strange hats and coats, peculiar hussar motifs, and not only. Diana experimented a lot. Not all experiments were successful, but an impeccable style was eventually formed. Largely thanks to the Princess of Wales, London of the 80s became the fashion capital of the world. Diana's growing popularity only irritated her husband. The servants of the palace repeatedly witnessed quarrels, during which antique dishes and antiques were broken. Just imagine this picture. An 18th century chair crashing through the window of the royal residence. It's exquisite. But seriously, at that moment, it became clear that not only the relationship was collapsing, but also a unique historical chance. After all, if you combine Diana's huge popularity and Charles' intellectual abilities, then the couple could achieve huge political and humanitarian results. Prince Charles, despite his slightly ridiculous image in public, as I have already said, is not just an intelligent person and an interesting conversationalist, but also one whose ideas were often ahead of time. He started talking about the importance of global warming and alternative energy methods long before it became mainstream. A separate megaproject of Charles was the development of organic farming. Talking to plants is from there. The idea itself is a canon, but is not important. In 1984, the couple's second son, Prince Harry, is born. The couple's relationship at that moment was so unimportant that a few years later, many will seriously discuss that Harry's father was a completely different person. But more on that later. Of course, the main factor that destroyed the relationship between the Prince and the Princess of Wales was the ongoing romance of the former with Camilla Parker Bowles. However, in the mid-80s, Diana still continued to struggle. On the 37th birthday of the Prince of Wales, she prepared an unexpected surprise for him. It was supposed to be a classical opera concert, which, in addition to Charles and Diana, was attended by a large number of aristocratic audiences. However, during the event, Diana suddenly came on stage and began to perform a dance number to the popular Uptown Girl song at that time. This became one of the highlights of the last season of the Crown series. The audience was delighted, Charles was furious. Unfortunately, there is no real video recording of the event, but some witnesses said that Charles was not that much annoyed, but rather detached and cold. And it sounds plausible. For 24-year-old emotional Diana, it was a cool gift. For a 37-year-old opera lover, Charles is a strange sight. 6 months earlier, Charles and Diana attended a huge charity concert. Who didn't sing there? David Bowie, Mick Jagger, Sting, Freddie Mercury, the main world stars. Events that are still remembered. The Prince of Wales later called it some kind of pop concert, to which his wife dragged him. Aggravated the situation of the couple's place of residence. In the mid-80s, they spent most of their time at Charles' residence called Highgrove in central England. Diana didn't like this place. She knew that Charles had acquired the estate largely because Camilla Parker Bowles lived nearby. The entire royal family was aware of Charles and Camilla's ongoing affair. Of course, they did not approve of what was happening and even tried to influence the prince. But he was an adult, so Diana, in general, was expected to come to terms with the fact of infidelity. As you have already understood, the life of the royal court is somewhat reminiscent of a Brazilian TV series. Everyone has secrets, and relationships on the side. However, according to the unspoken rules, all this should remain within the family and not interfere with the performance of duty. Diana didn't accept this fact, but she couldn't do anything. Charles was still absent from her life more often than the other way around. And in 1985, the princess begins an affair with her bodyguard Barry Monarchy. A year later, their relationship will become known to Monarchy's superiors from the royal guard, and he will be transferred to another duty station. 9 months after that, Monarchy will be dead. Diana fully believed that the death of her bodyguard was not an accident. This is believed by numerous supporters of the conspiracy version of the death of Diana herself. If it is really possible to consider suspicious details in a car crash in a Paris tunnel, then what happened to Monarchy is quite obvious. His motorcycle collided with the car of a 17-year-old inexperienced girl. And in the end, after Diana had a lot of lovers, most of whom are still alive and well. One of them is James Hewitt, a cavalry officer whom Diana encountered by chance in the palace and first invited to one of the parties. Then began to take riding lessons from him. Hewitt is considered by some to be the real father of Prince Harry. The bright red hair of both really gives rise to doubts. However, Prince Harry's red hair, in all likelihood, is the legacy of the Spencers. Diana's older sister, Sarah, has fiery red hair. And most importantly, the timing does not converge. Diana Hewitt's romance began only in '86, and Prince Harry was born 2 years earlier. Supporters of conspiracy theory are sure that in fact the relationship began much earlier. A DNA test could put an end to it, but, of course, no one will do it. Hewitt himself, for whom in the 90s and noughties an affair with Diana became the main form of earnings, gave opposite versions of what happened on TV shows and interviews that completely discredits his information. The relationship between Diana and James Hewitt will be interrupted and resumed. The final point in the 90s will be put by Diana herself when the information gets into the tabloids. She will simply stop communicating at the click of a finger. There is a version that Prince Charles was aware of his wife's affairs and did not prevent it, as he believed that it was good for Diana herself and their marriage. And he was right about something. By the end of the 80s, the Princess of Wales had already become a real celebrity. She met with the world's top politicians and show business stars. On her 27th birthday, the press called Diana the best thing that happened to the monarchy. I'm sure Elizabeth too was furious. At that moment, Britain was ruled by 3 women: Queen Elizabeth, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and Princess Diana. The latter absolutely naturally enjoyed incredible popularity against the background of the detached Queen and the tough Thatcher. In the second half of the 80s, despite all the troubles in her personal life, Diana realizes that she can use her popularity for the benefit of society. Then her charity initiatives begin, the main one of which was AIDS. In the 80s, the world was gripped by a new unknown deadly disease. However, due to a lack of information, AIDS was literally demonized. All those who fell ill were outcasts. In the 87th year, the country's first AIDS hospital opened in London. Diana was very worried before his visit. And it was there, within the walls of the hospital, that what can be called one of the main merits of the princess happened. She not only talked to the patients, but she shook hands with a dozen of them. To understand the courage of this act, it is enough to know that out of a dozen patients, only one agreed to be photographed. And even he did it with his back to the camera. It was one of the many charity events that the Princess of Wales attended. And some reproached her for filling her need for applause and universal attention in this way. And part of it was. Sometimes Diana specially adjusted the dates of the event in such a way that they coincided with Charles' events. And the next day she outshone him in all publications. But at the same time, she visited hospitals or homeless shelters many times without the press, just taking her sons with her, so that they could see the other side of life. By the early 90s, the tabloids, which largely created Diana's popularity, began to cross the line in relation to the royal family. However, even before that, they sometimes allowed themselves bold antics. For example, in 1982, when Diana was pregnant for the first time, her photos in a swimsuit were published in the newspapers. It was extremely unethical for that time. Fashion stars to be photographed naked during pregnancy will come much later. However, in the early 90s, the masks were dropped. It all started with the publication of the stolen intimate correspondence of Charles' sister, Princess Anne. This was followed by a scandal, and Anna and her husband announced their divorce. But it was only an aperitif. For the main course, the audience was waiting for the most intimate details of Diana and Charles' relationship on the side. In the early 90s, two bombs exploded in the British media space, Camilla Gate and Squidgy Gate, by analogy with the Watergate scandal of President Nixon. In the first case, a transcription of telephone conversations between Camilla Parker Bowles and Prince Charles was published in the newspaper. The marriages of both were already bursting at the seams by that time, but this was known only in the inner circle. For the general public, the proof of the Prince of Wales affair was a shock. This is despite the fact that the newspaper article omitted the most intimate moments. The full audio recording became available only a few years later. It can be found, including on YouTube. And if you don't know who the voices belong to, it feels like you're listening to phone sex, languid voices, and erotic fantasies. Diana, having heard the recording of this conversation in '93, admitted that she was most impressed not by the intimate details, but by their mutual friends with Charles, who were mentioned in the recording. From the context, it became clear that for many years they not only knew about the ongoing affair, but even provided their homes to Charles and Camilla as a meeting place. By the way, Camilla Gate happened by accident. An amateur radio operator, playing with his gadgets, caught the signal of this conversation. Since Prince Charles was relatively nearby with his cell phone, recognizing the voice, the man realized that he was sitting on a bag of money and took it to the newspaper. Charles and Camilla were just unlucky. Cell phones were still far from perfect. Meanwhile, the story of Squeegee Keith, namely the origin of the recordings of the conversation between Princess Diana and her lover James Gilby, is no longer so obvious. It was a brief affair at the end of the 89th. Diana and James had known each other for a long time, even before her marriage to Charles. The name of the Squidgy Gate she got from the English word squidgy or squid. That's what James called Diana during the conversation. The official origin of the Squeegee Gate is also associated with radio enthusiasts. However, later some experts doubted this theory. The main reason is as follows. James Gilby called Diana at the palace from his cell phone. Diana was talking on a landline phone, so one of the examinations showed that a recording of this quality could have been made only from a landline phone, which means that the source was not Gilby's phone. Moreover, the amateur radio operator who allegedly made it was later confused in his testimony regarding the day of recording. And this could be understood if the conversation did not take place the day before Christmas, a date that is difficult to confuse. In this case, the wiretap was installed right in the palace. Although, frankly speaking, the idea that members of the royal family could be bugged by the secret services looks pretty crazy. Despite this, Diana was sure that she was being followed. And new scandalous publications in the press with her participation were only a matter of time. In 1992, Diana was tormented by two problems. First, the threat of publication of letters from her ex James Hewitt. And the second problem is the imminent release of the book, in which the author promised to tell the public all the secrets of the love life of the Princess of Wales. Diana decided to be proactive. She hired a journalist to write the story of the princess' life from her words. So that no one from the royal family would find out about this, a real secret operation was invented. Diana's friend first took questions from the journalist, then brought them to Diana at the palace. She recorded her answers on a dictaphone, after which a friend passed the tape to a reporter. As a result, the book was called Diana: The True Story, from which readers learned that the royal palace is a cold and insensitive place, the same as its inhabitants. Her bulimia appeared due to the affair of Charles and Camilla. Their relationship with Charles was finally upset. After the birth of their second son Harry, Diana also told about the suicide attempt, how she threw herself down the stairs in the palace at the moment when she was pregnant for the first time. A terrible story that was a lie. That is, Diana really fell down the stairs. That's just according to the recollections of witnesses. It was only an accident, and not a suicide attempt. Diana just stumbled. The princess can be justified by the fact that this was her method of protection. She had few allies in the fight against the royal family. The book had a stunning effect. No one assumed that numerous intrigues and extramarital affairs are absolutely normal practice of the inhabitants of the palace. Everyone in the family was furious and suspected that Diana was the source of the book. She denied everything, and the family had no proof. After the death of the princess, the title of the book was supplemented. Diana is a true story told by herself. Only then did the author reveal that the source was the heroine herself. After the publication of the book in '92, the royal family, in fact, stopped communicating with Diana. The public's attitude was the opposite. There was a feeling that the Princess of Wales had become even more popular. They began not just to admire her, they began to empathize with her. As a result, in the same year, It was announced that the prince and the princess had broken up, not a divorce. That is, officially they continued to remain husband and wife, perform duties according to their title, and were engaged in the upbringing of their sons. It is unknown how long this condition would have lasted if it had not been for an interview for the BBC, which was first given by Charles and then by Diana. For Charles in 1994, it was supposed to be a 2-hour documentary, dedicated to the anniversary of his title of Prince of Wales. However, everyone understood that after Camelgate and Diana's book, most of the interview timing would be devoted specifically to marriage. As a result, when answering the question of whether he was faithful in marriage, Charles said yes until it became meaningless on both sides. Many viewers said afterwards that they were not even struck by the fact of the heir to the throne's betrayal. This has been guessed before. However, Charles was the first in the history of the royal family to publicly admit this. A year later, Diana gives her interview to the BBC. There she will tell you a lot that was previously known from the biography. The interview will go down in history with a phrase that can be translated as "there were 3 of us in this marriage," that is, it was quite crowded. After these interviews, it became obvious that the divorce of the Prince and Princess of Wales is only a matter of time. And so it happened in 1996. As a result of the agreement, Diana retained the title of Princess of Wales and, most importantly, custody of the children. Although it was clear that from that moment on, the main decision in the sons' lives would be made by the royal family. Since it was about potential heirs, Diana lost the title of Her Royal Highness, which she did not regret much. Also, an important aspect was the amount that Charles had to pay Diana after the divorce. It was equal to £17 million. At that time, a lot of money. In part, the figure is due to the fact that Diana, like other members of the royal family, was not aware of her spending. So, in the process of divorce, lawyers found out that she spent £3,000 a week on hairstyles. Anyway, 17 million was enough to start life from scratch. At one of the public events in the 96th, Diana's interlocutor said that he was sorry that the fairy tale of the Princess of Wales had such a sad ending. Diana, smiling, objected that this was not the final, but a new beginning. Diana lost part of the privilege, including round-the-clock security. Now she was accompanied only at public events on behalf of the crown. Part of her duties as a member of the royal family, she continued to perform. One of the guards who worked with Diana at the time recalled that she was very cheerful and open. She always sat in the front seat of the car, although according to the rules she was supposed to sit in the back. She loved to walk in casual clothes and ride a bicycle with her sons. The level of her popularity did not exactly fall after the divorce, perhaps even the opposite. Her friends were famous about politics and world celebrities. Even in her wardrobe there have been noticeable changes. For example, short dresses appeared, which was considered taboo for members of the royal family. Even before the official divorce from Charles, she began an affair with Hasnat Khan. They met by chance when Diana was visiting a friend at the London hospital, where Khan worked as a surgeon. Khan, a native of Pakistan, was a very modest man who shunned publicity. And at first, he and Diana managed to keep the affair a secret. Despite the fact that the Princess of Wales was hunted by radio day and night, they both liked to keep this atmosphere of secrecy. Khan bought dinner at a KFC restaurant, hid in the trunk of Diana's car, and thus he penetrated unnoticed into Kensington Palace, where the Princess of Wales continued to live after the divorce. Diana took their relationship so seriously that she went to visit Khan's family in Pakistan and even thought about converting to Islam. At the same time, Diana continued her humanitarian mission. In 1997, at the suggestion of the Red Cross, she went to Angola. There, the civil war, which had been going on for more than 20 years, was coming to an end. Anti-personnel mines have become widespread during the conflict. The situation was so serious that there were 15 million mines per 12 million people in the country. A huge number of people were without arms or legs. At that moment, there was a global discussion regarding the prohibition of the use of anti-personnel mines. And the UK officially opposed the ban. Diana visited the city of Quito, which was considered the most dangerous place in the country. Not only the Red Cross itself, but also the British Prime Minister was against the visit there. Despite all this, Diana, accompanied by reporters, went to the place that had been cleared by the bomb squad shortly before. But that didn't mean that Diana's life wasn't in danger now. Only a small piece of land was safe, with mines still sticking out to the right and left of it. Moreover, a few days before Diana's visit, several children were blown up at the same place checked by sappers. Diana did not just walk through a minefield, but did it several times, as some photographers did not have time to take a picture. These shots, of course, occupied the front pages of the British press. Under public pressure, the government had to support a ban against the use of mines. Moreover, a couple of months later, the Prime Minister's party lost the election, and the Labour Party, led by a young Tony Blair, took their place. However, the press did not only try to deify the Princess of Wales. The tabloids knew that news about her was the key to huge sales, and it didn't matter what the news was about. Soon, information about her affair with Hasnat Khan appears in the newspapers. And not just about the novel, but about the engagement. And although the latter was fake, for the humble Khan, it meant the end of the relationship. He wasn't ready to sacrifice his privacy. Diana was devastated. Against the background of the breakup, her obsessive thoughts about surveillance almost turned into paranoia. In the summer of the same 97th, she accepted the invitation of businessman Mohammed Al-Fayed to spend a vacation at his villa in the south of France. Al-Fayed, who was born in Egypt, was a very wealthy British entrepreneur. However, despite his billion-dollar fortune, the British establishment did not accept him as an equal. But he had a son, Dodi. The marriage of his son to the Princess of Wales could fix Mohammed's situation. So, thanks to Dodi's father, Al-Fayed met Diana. Their relationship quickly hit the tabloid pages. Some of these photos were taken on a tip from Diana herself to annoy Charles and Camilla, who was just turning 50. In the middle of summer. It was a series of all these events that led to the fact that on the night of the 31st of August, 1997, Diana Dodi Al-Fayed and two security officers found themselves in a Mercedes that crashed into support in the tunnel under the Alma Bridge. The paparazzi were on the spot right away as they were chasing Diana's car. Some of them tried to help the trapped people in the Mercedes, while others continued to perform their official duties. Despite the fact that literally minutes later, by a lucky chance, a doctor drove past the accident and was able to provide first aid to Diana, she died in the hospital a few hours later. The next day in Britain was called Quiet Sunday. Not because national mourning was declared, but simply many residents of the country took to the street to silently honor the memory of the princess. The streets of London were strewn with flowers, messages to Diana, and stuffed toys. Many world leaders, including British Prime Minister Tony Blair, have publicly expressed their condolences. The members of the royal family and Elizabeth herself did not say a word. Gradually, conspiracy theories about the death of Diana began to gain momentum. All of them can be reduced to one idea. What happened was not an accident. The Secret Services and the royal family are behind it. According to some sources, the driver was blinded by lasers. According to other sources, a sniper shot at the wheels. According to the third data, the mysterious car that pushed the Mercedes into the support is to blame. The reason for what happened, fans of conspiracy theory called Diana's pregnancy from the alpha, which the palace did not want to allow. However, in fact, there was no pregnancy. The absolute majority of conspiracy theories appeared in the press thanks to Dodi's father Mohammed Al-Fayed. He spared no expense on articles and documentaries that actively promoted the idea of the involvement of special services. The Alpha was probably partially aware of his guilt in the death of Diana and his son, since it was he who lobbied for their relationship. What really caused the death of the Princess of Wales was a tragic combination of circumstances. The paparazzi chasing Mercedes, of course, played a role. Dodi Al-Fayed, unlike Diana, was very nervous as he was not yet used to such attention. He was pushing the driver to go faster. If Al-Fayed and Diana, who were sitting in the back seat, had been strapped in, then most likely they could have survived. Later examination showed that the driver of the Mercedes was drunk, and he, in general, was not the driver. Henry Paul was the deputy head of security at the Ritz Hotel with problems in his personal life, which he solved with the help of alcohol. The only survivor of all four was the security guard sitting to the right of the driver. The driver and Dodi died on the spot. Someone blamed the sluggishness of French doctors for Diana's death. Allegedly, she was taken to the hospital too late. However, the truth is that the princess could not have been saved, even if the hospital was located directly opposite the scene of the tragedy. The condition was very serious. The Queen and the rest of the family remained silent at first, despite the condemnation from the British. The problem is that the closed institution of the monarchy considered Diana's death to be exclusively a family matter. The funeral was planned to be held closed without too much noise. However, under public pressure, the royal family gave up. First, they visited a spontaneous memorial, and then the Queen made an address to the nation on television. The death of Princess Diana came as a shock to the whole of Britain. Prince Charles was seriously afraid for his safety because many blamed him and the royal family for the death. The monarchy had to change. Yes, traditions, rituals, and other duties are still observed, And judging by the interview that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle gave Oprah Winfrey, life in the palace is still far from a fairy tale. However, changes still followed. In 2005, Prince Charles was finally allowed to marry Camilla. Diana's children Prince William and Prince Harry married girls not of blue blood. Today, the royal family is everywhere, from Instagram to Twitter and YouTube. Of course, the Queen hardly maintains accounts personally, but it was simply impossible to imagine such a degree of openness before Diana. However, we may see Diana's main achievement later. Prince William, raised by a princess with her open display of care, married for love, will one day become the King of Great Britain. And it is likely to be a completely different monarchy.